Today on The Game Adventure, we're breaking down some major changes in both Xbox and Sony's approach to video games, Pokemon Pokopia takes over the world, and some discussion on how we compensate the people making our favorite games. Let's dive in. The Game Adventure Podcast is a weekly, family-friendly show keeping you up to date on all the latest news in video games. We'll also mix in a heavy dose of nostalgia with retro games and even things like how the worlds of tech and culture and even faith interact with video games as an art form. We're doing it all in less than an hour every Saturday morning, so let's get started. Hey, what's up, everybody? Hope you had a fantastic week. Thanks so much for joining me again. I actually let my kids listen to the very first episode of the podcast last week, and about half of them listened to it twice. They said it was awesome. I think they're a little biased, but I'm really glad to be getting out another episode again this week. We've got some pretty big stuff happening in the industry, so let's go ahead and jump right into the industry headlines. So last week we heard that Xbox had kind of given a name or a nickname to the next-gen Xbox, and it was Project Helix. But this week we actually got some confirmation that yes, it is the next-gen console, and a couple of pieces of information. Some of the things that are kind of top-line stuff is it's going to have a custom AMD system on chip that's going to be the next generation of DirectX. It's going to include stuff like next-gen ray tracing, GPU-directed work graph execution. I'll talk about that in a second. A whole upscaling and a whole bunch of other stuff. And it looks like alpha development kits, the kits that go out to the developers first, is going to actually ship out next year or as early as next year. The big piece of news that dropped around this, though, was that the console is going to natively play Xbox and PC games with direct links to storefronts even, which you can imagine is going to change things for Xbox. Storefronts like Steam, Epic, others. Expecting this to take place sometime in the next 2 years. One of the cool things that I heard specifically about the hardware itself was this GPU-directed work graph execution. So the way that I can explain this, I think, the best is basically the way your CPU and your GPU work together is that your CPU gives the jobs to the GPU, to your graphics card to do. And the ability of the graphics card to do that quickly is limited by how many jobs the CPU can actually send to it. And so what this new work graph execution is going to do, this GPU directed, is it basically lets the graphics card go and decide which jobs to take without having all of them have to be dished out by the CPU. So it's going to be a lot faster without actually having to ramp up the CPU as much as you would have otherwise. So it's a really cool example of like technology changing in a way that we didn't expect, so that we don't necessarily need what we thought we needed even, a couple of years ago to make this next leap in what Xbox is calling graphical fidelity. So these graphics are going to look better than they ever have before, according to Xbox, and it's not going to take as much power as they thought it was. They just have to be smarter with the power that they have. Now, what is it going to cost to get something like this? It sounds like expected pricing is kind of pitched somewhere around the $1,000 to $1,300 mark. So we are definitely looking at a $1,000 plus console, which those of us who have been into PC gaming in the past, that is a low-end gaming PC. So it's not, I'm not getting sticker shock over it necessarily, but it is a lot for a console. So what this really shows us is Microsoft is shifting their traditional console model even more. So the way that consoles usually make money is they don't actually make money on the console itself. So like Microsoft will lose money manufacturing an Xbox, selling it at the price point that they will. But what they're banking on is that every game that people buy on their console, they actually get around 30%, depending on the negotiated deal with the company that makes the game, around 30% of software sales. So because the makers of the game can only sell it on Xbox to Xbox players, basically they're guaranteed a piece of every bit of software that's sold for that. So by opening up the platform and allowing like Steam games to sell on Xbox, they're definitely prioritizing the reach of their audience, trying to get to more people over hardware control. And so there's kind of a mixed bag with this. Some people are not excited because they don't like Windows. We kind of talked about that last week. Some people are excited because actually they're already a PC gamer and this might be a good piece of hardware to play modern PC games on. Especially, man, if I can get those Steam deals, those sales that Steam runs all the time, and I can get my games at much, much cheaper and still play them at a high fidelity, I think that's going to be fantastic. So there are a couple of technical hurdles with this, and it'll be interesting to see what Xbox does, because Windows computers and Xbox run pretty differently. And so you'd basically need a partition for each to run unless they're doing something entirely different. So we'll see what happens with that. I think it's pretty exciting. Basically, we're moving closer and closer to an Xbox PC that is going to be able to run pretty much all of the games that you would want it to, with the exception of PlayStation games. So that brings us to the next piece of news. PlayStation is actually doing the opposite. So PlayStation, if you remember, a little while ago, started putting AAA titles, their titles on PC. And that was a pretty big deal. And it was kind of a mixed bag. Yeah, it was cool, but you needed a pretty beefy PC to run it. And you had to get the settings just right. And there was some issues with that. But largely, you thought that if you thought initially that Sony was opening things up to put their PlayStation titles on a computer, now they're actually going back. And so they're backing away from PC and they're saying, well, we're not necessarily going to continue to do that. And the reason for that is, I think, twofold. First of all, Sony did make quite a bit of money. So estimates are around like $2.2 billion from PC ports over 5 years. However, those games were actually potentially worth more if those people had purchased them on on a PlayStation. And so you have kind of this interesting thing that happens when you put your games on a PC. Your game for $60 is running right alongside a $10 discounted game on like similar game from Steam. So you kind of, it's harder to sell, especially games like Spider-Man Remastered, for example. So it leaves you kind of feeling like Sony is trying to figure out, okay, if Xbox is going all in on PC, what happens if we back away from the PC and go back to just PlayStation for the PS6 whenever that happens? And then there's also the potential for Sony to be making a handheld PlayStation, which is supposed to be very powerful indeed. And we don't have a ton of details on that yet. But if they're doing that, they're really creating an ecosystem that's very much like Nintendo, where you have people who are PlayStation gamers and they have their handheld and they have their PlayStation 6 and they play games on their PlayStation. So that's much more similar to Nintendo. Meanwhile, Nintendo just kind of does what they have always done, and they have everything only on Nintendo, which I'm a big Nintendo fan. I kind of like it, so no complaints from me. The next thing on like the industry-wide news is PlayStation again doing some pricing testing. And so basically what they've done is they've created something called dynamic pricing that they've been testing. Rates, the discounts kind of range between like 5 and just under 20% on around 100 games. And so what they'll do is they'll look at your data, and which they have a lot of, and they decide to offer you a game at a certain discount, a certain price, offer you specific sales that are specific to you. And people are not big fans of this. They're saying it's manipulative, especially the industry analysts that I've listened to have talked about how this is manipulative because they have an infinite supply of the digital game. It's not actually limited constraints. So they're manipulating the market and the consumer. And I think it's because you can't go someplace else to buy a PlayStation game necessarily, unless you've got a couple of those games on PC. It makes people feel like they're stuck into only getting the sales that are offered just to them in this specific instance. It feels unfair, they say. I would push back a little bit and just say, as far as a marketing practice goes, that's pretty normal. Like, I get emails all the time from companies that are offering me a specific deal because I got on their email list and because I saw them on social media, and they're tracking my activity in that way, and they're trying to get me to buy their product. And they're trying to give me incentives that they think are going to make me actually pull the trigger and buy their product. So it's not weird from a marketing standpoint. I think where this is weird is the fact that they have so much information on you when it comes to the product that they sell. So think about how much info Sony has on your playing activity. They know exactly what games you play. They know what time you play. They know a whole lot about your schedule, actually, from what you play. They know what you have purchased games for in the past, what percentage of a sale price seems to make you pull the trigger on things. So that, I think, is where the feeling of being manipulated comes in, is that they have so much data that it's really easy for them to market to you. And whether or not that's a bad thing, I don't know. I really think it's, in this case, up to the consumer, me, to decide whether I spend money or not. And so we just have to be realistic about what's our budget for games, what are the games that we really care about supporting, and not being suckered into buying something just because it happens to be on sale. That's my take on it anyway. The last piece of big news is the EA Battlefield layoffs. So if you remember, Battlefield 6 came out and basically sold 7 million copies in like a couple of days. It was one of the biggest selling games of the year. And now we just got news that they pretty much are cutting the majority of the team that worked on this game. They laid off staff across a bunch of different things, a bunch of different studios, and saying it's a realignment. And what they're really doing is they're cutting the easiest cost to cut, which is people. And that's kind of gross. It's kind of like these developers are really being treated like almost construction crews, where they're, hired to build a structure. And then once the structure's built, they're pretty much done, except for a few people that do the upkeep. And the problem is that wasn't the deal that these people thought they were getting. Most of these people thought that they were brought on as an employee to work in these studios across various projects. Maybe this is the project we're working on now, but imagine if most people in the business world were hired into a company, thought that they had a steady job, and then as soon as a project was finished, they were cut and let go. Without having that been communicated as the norm. So we really need to change something, it seems, in the industry, either to adjust compensation to reflect that contractual nature. So you're getting either residuals from the games that are being sold, you're getting some sort of compensation that makes sense for you to take on the risk of working on a contract or a smaller project for a smaller amount of time. That's what freelancers do. They charge a higher amount because they know I might not be employed after this project is done. Or the companies need to adopt longer-term thinking instead of just gambling with live service games and other things that are going to affect their bottom line to the point where they have to let people go as soon as each project is done. So that's pretty much it for the main news. Let's move on to tech and hardware. There were some pretty cool announcements around display technology with Apple, actually, of all places. They're announcing a new studio display that is a 5K monitor, and it's a 27-inch 5K monitor. It's got 120 hertz plus refresh rates, and it's going to be hitting the market soon. However, there's some question as to whether 5K in a monitor is really necessary. Because you start to get really diminishing returns. So yeah, it's 5K, really high resolution, but in what situations are you actually going to notice that high a resolution? I actually ran into this myself because I'm running mostly off of a Mac Mini that is a couple years old, and my Mac Mini, basically, it can run 4K, but I found that it was better for me to run 1440 on my Mac Mini because it was so much easier on the hardware to do that. And I can even have an additional screen that really gives me some nice screen real estate. And yes, it may not be quite as sharp, but for most of the stuff that I'm doing, it looks great. And when you have video games in particular that are essentially running at 4K tops, unless you're running a PC that's really making things high resolution, even then you'd really be hard pressed to find a machine that's pushing too much past 4K. And I guess the bigger question is why? Why would you want to go any higher resolution? And for a little bit of difference in the actual visual picture, but a lot of difference in how hard the machine has to work to actually churn this out. Another kind of cool tech piece is the RTX 5050. So NVIDIA, the manufacturer of video cards, is talking about, they do a lot more than that, but one of the things that they've done in the past is graphics cards. And so they're talking about releasing a 9 gigabyte version of the RTX 5050, which is a pretty nice card. And basically what they're doing is they're adding more efficiency to an existing type of card to deal with the issue of the RAM-pocalypse that we talked about. There's difficulty finding enough RAM. And so what they're doing is they're making the existing card that they have even more efficient. And it basically means that you can do more graphically intense work on an older card than you would have been able to do otherwise. So yeah, it's a new card. They're changing some things about it, but essentially this is a great example of the constraints, the limitations of what's available, causing companies to say, let's use some ingenuity. Let's do something unique to solve for this problem with what we have available to us. Finally, in the tech news area, we've got Valve announcing that the Steam Machine is apparently back on track. They are planning to release it still in 2026, despite memory shortages and issues with tariffs. So there's a lot of excitement around this, but also I think some real concern over what the price tag is going to be, given that lots of things have gone up in price in the tech world recently. Is Valve really going to be able to release this box, this computer that will run on that will sit nicely on your TV stand? And the question is, how much is Xbox going to tell us about the new Xbox before we actually find out the prices and the details around Valve's Steam machines? Because if we have all the information, that'll be kind of an interesting combination. It'll be a hard choice. If Xbox really decides to go with Project Helix and kind of go the direction they say they're going to go, how do we compare those two? And is the Xbox worth waiting for, or am I able to do pretty much everything I want to do with my Steam machine at a similar price point, potentially like a year to 2 years earlier than the new Xbox? So that'll be interesting. With that, let's move into my point of view. Today, we're talking about the ethics of game economics, which sounds really boring, but I promise it's not. So we find ourselves at kind of an interesting point in time where we have more access to video games than ever before because of these subscription models. But the question for me remains, the gaming community compensates the creators of these games, right? Like we have to compensate them in order for them to continue making games. And so the way that we do that, and to the extent that we do that, actually really shapes the quality and longevity and even like the artistic ambition, the trying something new of the games that we play. And our financial vote actually determines the industry's future in a lot of ways. We, as the consumer, actually have a lot of power here. And in a world where we have these consumer access things with subscription models, I think there's a kind of threat that happens here because subscription models, especially those that use like a flat fee buyout, so like Game Pass, for example, kind of disconnects a game's financial reward from its long-term engagement and quality. And what that does is that encourages developers to prioritize the volume or the content that they're putting out over polish and ingenuity. And it leads to kind of a race for good enough instead of creating the next masterpiece. So if you don't know, a lot of times when a indie developer, for example, makes a video game and it gets bought up by Xbox, they say, we're going to put it on our Game Pass. What happens is they give a lump sum to the developer. The developer says, yay, I made some money and I get to go make the next game. But they're not necessarily compensated for how much that game is played. So if they make a really good game, they're going to get that same lump sum versus making something that's just good enough. And maybe the first part of the game is fun and then it kind of goes downhill from there. But who cares, because they got the game out, they're getting the money for it. So it doesn't really leave a space for creating something that's really great. And I think back in the day when we used to spend, $60 on a game, that was the only way that you would get a game, or more, actually, if you went back far enough. A $70 purchase, for example, becomes a pretty decent contribution to that game's makers, the people who made that game. And so when you're looking at like a $20 subscription, the financial signal or the feedback from people who are buying the games gets pretty small, because it removes that incentive for the developers to spend those extra couple of months refining a game, making it a classic, because they're just trying to churn out the game fast enough to get to the next thing so that they can keep their job and continue to work. And so it's kind of, we're making them grind out these designs, and instead of having a compensation system based on how much the game is actually enjoyed or used, we're just trying to have them pump them out as quickly as possible. So I wonder if there might be an option. My thought on this is, how do we preserve the quality, the art of gaming? I think compensation has to be tied directly to the player's engagement. A user-centric kind of model where a player's subscription fee is split proportionally among the games that they actually play that month. I think that restores that link to the people who actually make the game getting compensated for the work that's being done, the game that's being enjoyed. I don't know if you can hear my dog snoring in the background. He's really loud. I have a dog. His name is Kevin. This is totally off topic. Kevin is the best dog ever, and he is like a mix of like a bunch of different dogs, but the sweetest dog and the loudest snort I've ever heard. But man, that dog loves to be with me in the studio whenever I'm recording something. So if you hear Kevin snoring in the background, just think of it as wonderful white noise, bringing calm to your otherwise busy day. To close up this idea, if you look at systems like Spotify, for example, or Apple Music, where as a musician, that's something that I use. I submit my music to those services and they make it available for people to play. And then I actually get paid based on how often people listen to my music. And that means the better music I make, the more often it gets played and the more compensation I get. Now, to be fair, Spotify is a horribly unfair system, and they completely take advantage of the fact that they have a monopoly on the market, and to get your music heard, you basically have to provide it to Spotify. But if we could solve for that and actually make a substantial amount of money go to the people making the games, I think we would kind of reestablish that value for quality link. So that's my thought for this week. I think we're kind of in a world where we have a system that prioritizes a huge library and low monthly cost, but the risks of killing the financial incentive are pretty high for genuine artistry, instead of keeping a system that rewards artistry and high quality product. So with that, let's go to the Retro Rewind. Not a ton of news this week on the retro front. One thing I did want to kind of make a note of is this game that was developed called Quad. And Quad, Quad, is basically a fully playable, low poly, Quake style FPS that is compressed into just 64 kilobytes. And it was done kind of as a challenge to see, can we make this game even smaller and have it still run? And the one thing that they did was to kind of do this magic in the coding, right? Doing tricks like, for example, something they used to do in old games was only modeling half of an enemy. So they would mirror it basically. So instead of having to create a whole enemy character model, they would create half of one, and then they would, in the coding, tell it to mirror that. So show that as a mirrored item. And so you only have to do half the work for the entire character model. And thus you can put it into an even smaller amount of space. So I thought that was pretty cool. I heard about that, and it's something that I definitely want to check out just to see how it looks. I was never like a huge Quake fan. That was just a little bit before my time with video games. But I love seeing innovation, especially innovation that thinks the way that we used to think about video games, where it was a really limited palette that we had to work with. The technology was really limited, and we wanted to see how much can I accomplish with just what I have in front of me. I love that ingenuity that comes out of that. And you know what? With that, let's go ahead and jump over to the game list. Okay, so the biggest game on this list is the thing that kind of took over the world this last week, Pokemon Pokopia. Basically, this game that was created by Game Freak, the original creators of Pokemon, has sold 2.2 million copies in just 4 days. It's also resulted in physical keycards selling out completely in a lot of locations, which is pretty funny because those physical keycards, while you have the box art, they're really just a piece of code that tells the Switch that you own the game, and then you have to download it anyway. So for me, man, the allure of physical games on the Switch 2 has kind of been lost for me. So I'll be pretty much exclusively buying the digital games because that's really how I'm getting it, whether I get the card or not. A lot of people have said it combines Pokemon catching with mechanics from like Animal Crossing and Minecraft and even stuff like Dragon Quest Builders. So basically, it's been universally praised. Everyone loves the idea of like the checklist chore type of gameplay. I'm thinking maybe that's something I need to make for my kids, like a Pokopia kind of checklist for them to do their household chores. It's got some like really mysterious lore because it takes place in a post-apocalyptic Kanto region. It's got like habitat style puzzles where you're trying to attract different kinds of Pokemon to spawn in different areas. A lot of people are saying this is the best Nintendo game in a long time, which is really cool. Basically, it's able to drip feed the mechanics without completely overwhelming players. And it really kind of takes away the stressful real-time clock type penalty with Animal Crossing. So pretty much you can come back and play anytime you want to. And there's no weeds that have suddenly cropped up because you haven't played in 4 days, which I thought was kind of a fun thing in Animal Crossing. That didn't bother me at all, but that's cool that they're doing it differently. I think basically this game is a great one to get for the kids. And my kids are going to flip when they listen to this episode of the podcast. And I say, I'm probably going to get this game so that we can play it together. Because it's really highly accessible. It's really a good excitement for the family, but kind of a chill game to play at night, which I'm always looking for games to play together that are easy for everyone to get in on. However, it does kind of open a dilemma because we only have one Switch 2 and we're definitely not a 2 Switch 2 kind of household. Like, I don't know who has that kind of free-flowing income. I certainly don't. So that means I'm going to have to have the kids come pile into my office and we're going to play Pokopia on the Switch 2, which, it's not such a bad thing, maybe, after all. But yeah, I'm excited to share some more of that with you once I get a chance to actually play it. The next game on the list is Yoshi and the Mysterious Book. This one has been talked about for a while, and it is actually launching on May 21st for $59.99. It's basically the most beautiful visual style, I think, because it uses watercolor and claymation kind of aesthetic where players get to discover and name the creatures that they find. I think the only downside that I've heard about this is that it's pretty low in difficulty, which some, I guess, adults are unhappy about because it's so easy that it's not going to be challenging enough for an older player to actually enjoy it. So it is definitely on the made for kids kind of area of games. I don't think that's a bad thing, though. I'm actually really excited about that. Just this last week, I was having a conversation with my son multiple times, who is 6, and he's asking, Dad, can you find a game for me? And so maybe Yoshi and the Mysterious Book is that game. Maybe it's a game that he's going to enjoy, especially because games like Pokepia, for example, is great, but it also has a lot of text. And so that's going to be difficult for a 6-year-old to keep up with the amount of text that you have to read. So maybe Yoshi and the Mysterious Book is going to be a better fit for he and I to play together. You know, I'm all about finding games to play with my kids. Speaking of not games, but other things to do with your kids, the Super Mario Galaxy movie releases on April 1st. It's going to be, I think, pretty good. I'm excited to go see it with my kids. Definitely one of those that I think would be fun to see in theaters. I'm sure the music will be great. The voice actors are top notch. Lots of throwbacks, nostalgic throwbacks for the older folks in the audience. So I'm excited about that. Under PlayStation games, we did talk about High Guard. Last week is that game that came out and then subsequently shut down. It came out on January 26th, and believe it or not, shut down just 45 days later on March 12th, which was just this last Thursday. Basically, it was a game that they poured tons of money into making and then launched it kind of bare bones. And it was so bare that people played it for a little bit and then decided to quit. And as it is with that type of game, once your players start to drop off, everybody starts to leave because they think that the game is kind of done. The next game on the list is Bungie's new extraction shooter that is out now on the PS5, actually. So Marathon is out, and I've heard kind of mixed reviews. Some people say it's a lot of fun, but the people who are complaining about it not being fun are the ones who die often, and you don't get to revive easily, and you lose your stuff when you die. So I understand that ratchets up like the adrenaline feeling. But for people like me who only have a little bit of time to play at night, I think it would be crushing to get in and lose basically all the stuff that you spent your hour playing gaining. It just feels like the bar might be a little bit high for people who are parents with only an hour of gaming at night. That seems like a little bit of a tough pill to swallow. I don't know. Might not be for people like me, and that's okay. The next piece of news is Starfield. So Starfield, you're like, that's not new. That came out on Xbox a long time ago. But the big news is that it's actually coming to PS5, physically and digitally, which I thought was kind of wild. They're actually making a physical PS5 disc for Starfield. So, I mean, I think the big news here is that this is a good chance for developers to recoup some investment. Starfield was a huge project, and a lot of people put a lot of time into making it what it is. It is an enormous game. And so having it actually show up on the PlayStation with a brand new audience who can experience Starfield, I think that's actually a really good thing. Definitely, it's not going to be like a remaster or fixing a Starfield 2.0. Todd Howard pretty much said that was not going to happen. But I think even as is, it's going to be a great game for more people on PS5 to experience. Some other highlights from the game list would be some of the independent titles that came out of the Xbox showcase lately. Two of the games that particularly piqued my eye were Delphinium, is like a 2.5D post-revolution game. And what I think is cool about this is it's a solo developer. So it gives me kind of the feeling of like a Stardew Valley kind of thing. Like one person actually did all of the work and made this dream come to life. I think that's so cool. So I might have to get it just to support them. And it looks like a cool game too. The other game is Screenbound, which is called like a 5D puzzle platformer. It combines it says 5D because it combines 2D and 3D movement. So it makes me think a little bit of like Zelda, where you had the 2D and the 3D components, but it's totally unique. So I'm excited to take a little bit of a look at that. Finally, under like the other stuff from PC games in particular, we have a game called Rounds, which is not a new game. It actually came out in 2021. It's an indie shooter, but it's become popular because the loser gets a randomized stackable perk. And I think this is a great example of a PC discovery phenomenon, right? Where games come out, they may have gotten missed, but because of the way Steam works and PC games work, people will just find these treasures and start talking about them, and they get like a second life years later. I've also heard that this is a great game for accessibility, young kids in particular. It has really simple controls. You just jump, shoot, and shield. And so finding a place to play this, I mean, we'll have to see, but it might be a really great game to play with your kids if you've got a PC set up for that. And that brings us to the end of the game news. And so before we go, I want to jump into one quick listener question. So I would love to get some more interactivity with you who are listening. One of the questions I kind of brought up earlier was that my son, my 6-year-old, was asking, what's a good game for me, Dad? What's a game for me to play? And we've tried some of the Mario games. We've tried Sonic. We've tried like 3D games like Minecraft. And they all seem to be just a little bit challenging for where he's at. And so a question that I have is, what are the games that you recommend for really tight controls but easy mechanics so that kids can build confidence and enjoy playing a video game? And we've tried also games like Paw Patrol games, because my kids loved Paw Patrol, especially when they were younger. And the problem was they're terrible. They're terrible as games. They're loose controls. They make kids, like, it's awful because they just threw this game together and they make kids feel like I'm just bad at video games. And then I'll play it and I'll be like, no, you're not bad at video games. Everybody's bad at this game because it's a terrible game. You can't even make the dog jump up onto a platform without doing it 3 or 4 times. So come on. I called out Yoshi and the Mysterious Book as being a potential game. That doesn't come out till May. So I'd love to hear from you. What games did you play early on with your kids that they enjoyed? What are some titles that you would recommend for being like really easy, but also really fun first games for your kids to play? And that pretty much wraps it up for us this week on The Game Adventure. Thanks so much for listening, and I look forward to doing this all over again with you next Saturday. I'll see you then.